Okay, so when we think of the role that research tends to play in science fiction, one of the first questions we have to ask is what subgenre of science fiction are we writing? Because that's going to determine what kinds of research are expected of us. So, for example, you might look at something like contemporary medical thrillers. Now, there is a science element, and it can even be mildly speculative. Now, if for it to be a true science fiction piece set in contemporary technology, this is where we get a piece that may speculate that there's some secret or hidden technology while also setting the piece in a contemporary era. Um, so basically, the idea would be you tell a real world story that also has some semi invented but also very plausible technologies in it. Then there is more traditional speculative science fiction. This is where we get something like, I don't know, the Oscar-winning film Gravity, or 2001: Space Odyssey minus the alien artifact. And the hallmark of this kind of speculative science fiction is that while new technologies may be invented for the telling of the story, they are as strongly grounded in our understanding as possible, simply seeking the front line of our knowledge. And so you get a piece that, is set in zero gravity. It works with science elements that aren't part of the sort of day-to-day life of most people. A lot of stories that involve things like, artificial intelligence are also sort of going this route as well. They're taking a real technology and they're attempting to extrapolate. Where would this be in the near future, and where would this be going? However, this contrasts against a different form of science fiction, which often is referred to as science fantasy. So, a good example of science fantasy is Star Wars. We often think of Star Wars as a science fiction classic, but the truth is, there's almost no science in it. Yeah, there are there are starships, which kind of resemble, to a loose extent, contemporary spacecraft. But even those work with a kind of technology that is essentially indistinguishable from magic. Basically, you have things like inertial dampeners and accelerating and maneuverability abilities that just simply aren't physically possible. You have, ships that travel faster than the speed of light, which, according to our understanding, is literally would break the laws of the universe. And so, science fantasy often has a very hand waving approach to the science, and instead, you'll sort of sprinkle maybe a little bit of sort of known science in order to sort of try to steer away too much from that fantasy feel. But otherwise, there's not a whole lot of difference from the science in Star Wars and the magic in your classic sword and sorcerer's film. And so, basically, that's going to be the biggest question. If you're writing science fantasy, you're probably going to be doing just enough research to give the veneer of credibility to your science, to make it feel like science rather than just pure magic. In a more speculative fiction, where we're trying to project into the future, that's where your heaviest research is probably going to take place in terms of looking at frontline science, trying to see where things are going, what theoretical models are emerging. And then finally, if you want to write something that's grounded in contemporary technology, that's going to be the most research heavy in some respects, because you're going to be looking to understand the details and nuances of real world technologies, and you're going to want to do so accurately, because readers who read those are likely going to have a pretty comfortable level of knowledge to be able to spot significant inconsistencies. So, yeah, different kinds of research for the different subgenres. Each one, the science adds flavor, it adds strength and sometimes power to the narrative, but also at the same time, it's going to help us manage our expectations. It's going to help us decide where in the process the research is going to take place, and so on and so forth. So yeah, ask that about what you're working on. What level of science versus how close is that science to magic? The, the problem with Google as a search engine for scientific writing is the way in which research results are prioritized. First and foremost, they are prioritized by paid advertisements to begin with, and of course, interesting science is never going to be at the point that it's a product. It's always going to be theoretical, it's going to be conceptual, at least the kind of interesting science that we want to use for writing a science fiction piece. So, second, though, popularity of results is the second reason that Google and other search engines prioritize. And that is equally problematic because we are looking to do original writing. We're trying to find new territory. We're doing research because we want to write about things that people don't already know about. And so, yeah, if we search through Google, we're literally going to be focused on things that are either already in the product phase of the idea cycle or they are the most popular renditions of it. You can argue that, sure, you can scroll further down, but the truth is, most ideas worth building on, most ideas that are front line in science that are worth speculating on, are going to be behind things like paywalls, and they might be in more inaccessible forms through open internet searches. Another issue we may run into while trying to research science fiction is that a lot of the ways we come across the niftiest science fiction or science ideas is through popular news sources like Popular Science or Scientific American. Now, I will say, first off, these can be tremendously fun to read. The journalists literally seek out the coolest sounding sciences. They want things that would actually sound quite appropriate for science fiction. And so there's going to be a temptation to be like, oh my gosh, I just read about the coolest thing. The problem is that, first off, because it's in a popular source like Scientific American or Popular Science, there's already a good chance that a ton of people know about it. And so it's going to lose some of its novelty. Now, that being said, you might be like, well, yeah, but you can still tell a fantastic story with that. And that is absolutely true. But here's the second problem. One of the biggest challenges in science fiction is carving your own space, of coming up with new and novel science concepts that haven't already been done. And here's the thing, if it's in popular science, it means that it's already been studied extensively. It's probably been published in multiple forms. It's been read by scholars and students. And at that point, there's also a high likelihood that somebody is already working on the same concept for their stories. And so, one thing you can have happen is, it can take a long time to write a strong science fiction narrative. You might be looking at a couple of years from beginning to end of the project. And so, you might be a year in, you've completed research, you're sitting down to write, and then suddenly you see an announcement that there is a book with the exact same premise. And that's a problem. That can be a major bar to publication. Now, I'll say it's not the end of the world. You can have an overlapping premise. You might see things like when Deep Impact and Armageddon released at the same time, or there's that contemporary controversy over the film Together, the horror film about the couple whose bodies start to merge together. There's a plagiarism accusation for that one for somebody who had come up with a very similar concept, but in that case, it wasn't plagiarism. It turns out the timelines didn't match up in the way they needed to, but even then, it's still a concern. It's a fear. And something we see in Hollywood all the time. We have these simultaneous stories emerging. And here's the thing, when we see those, it's often like, oh, okay, well, just because these two stories came out at the same time, it means it's not a big deal, right? But that just happens to be stories that were developed at the same time. If one of them was developed and set to come out 2 years later, that could be problematic. It could feel like a copycat, even when it's not. So, Scientific American, wonderful, wonderful magazine. Popular Science, again, same thing. But these are ideas that have already excited people enough that they became fit for these popular readerships. So, something to be careful about is, popular, broad spectrum magazines like that won't give you the frontline science that you need. So at this point, it might be tempting just to throw your hands up in the air. You can't use search engines. can't use magazines. That also, of course, extends to things like science news reporting. If you saw it on Channel 8 or something like that, there's no way it's going to be a fresh enough premise that the science is going to hold up. If you saw it on a Netflix documentary, no chance it's going to work. It's just going to be too popularized. It's not to say that you can't innovate or tell more grounded stories, but it's going to hurt your ability to market yourself as innovative, original science fiction. That being said, the real solution is one that sounds more difficult than it is, and that is search academic journals. Now, these are pretty easy to access. If you get on the open internet, you can use Google Scholar to do some searching for it. It does help if you have some idea what you're searching for. But that being said, you also can go down to a local municipal library and use that search their search engines as well. But basically, the thing about scientific journal articles is well, first off, they're emerging research. These are the reports, the detailed reports on studies that have just come out. So some of them will literally have only been encountered by a couple of dozen people when you do. And it takes time for ideas to spread. So if you're actively seeking them out, this is how you get ahead of the game. Now, it helps, of course, if you have your other writing skills sharp, if your abilities to create prose, images, setting, etc., are at the top of their game. That way, you can hit the ground running when you come across a cool idea. But academic journal articles also are more accessible than most people think. I know. You may have some nightmarish experience of working with them in a high school English class or maybe a college writing course or something along those lines. But the truth is, if you understand the conventions of the writing, if you understand how they're organized and presented, it can actually be very easy to navigate them. It does take time, but most things worth doing do take time. And if you want to be original, if you want to be innovative, you're going to have to put in some effort. But here's the real kicker of it, though. The vast majority of most scientific articles in academic journals, you don't need to understand them. It's as simple as that. When they get into the data analysis and things in those segments, you don't need to be able to follow that. What you need to be able to do is you need to be able to patiently read through their introductions. You also would want to look maybe a little bit at their literature review. It might give you a sense of some of the other ideas that are circulating around this topic. But you also want to be able to read their analysis and conclusions. If you don't understand a stretch, that's fine. You're looking for the big strokes here. When we write with research, and this is something I'm going to talk about, further on, when we write with research, it's not like we're going to be writing a research report on it. We're not going to be paraphrasing lengthy stretches that require us to have a detailed, based understanding of the line-by-line writing. No, absolutely not. Instead, we're looking for concepts that we can put at the center of stories or that we can dangle in the background of stories. As a result, if you understand the overview that they give at the opening, if you understand the conclusions they draw at the end, you're going to know what the science is and what its outcome is, and you can move quickly through a lot of that intervening material. And this isn't to say that I'm trying to recommend poor scholarship or something like that. If you want to read them all carefully and thoroughly, you're of course encouraged and welcome to do so. But my point is that if we're simply looking to build unique science narratives and science fiction narratives, the resources are there. It's actually easier to find than you might think. And if you're willing to put in a reasonable amount of effort, I think you'll find it can put you into very unique, original territory, dealing with ideas that aren't even thoroughly tested, where people are still openly speculating about their possibilities. And that is the perfect ground for science fiction research. Okay, so when we think about research, we often think it's some sort of step that everything has to be done up front. You're going to research everything, and when you sit down to write, it's like you don't stop and look anything up. And that's just not true. Instead, we break research up into different stages, and during those different stages of research, we can do different kinds of writing. So, for example, we often begin with preliminary research. This is where we test out the core premises to make sure that the major science elements in science fiction work. So, for example, if for some reason your plot requires humanity to douse the sun, to put out the sun, and you have some idea in mind for how that might be possible, this is probably going to be the point where you want to figure that out, because something that big is probably going to be the crux of your plot. And if it doesn't hold up to at least some scientific scrutiny, if it's not even remotely feasible, you're going to lose a huge chunk of readership. So these are the kinds of elements we look at up front. Similarly, if you're writing something about traveling at the speed of light or approaching the speed of light, and you want to have a ship accelerating towards it in a way that's at least partially realistic, you probably want to do a little bit of research into how structures can withstand acceleration, what kind of rate of acceleration you'd be looking at to accomplish that, and so on and so forth. Again, that way you know that the basic physical premise of your piece can hold up. At the same time, though, it's worth noting that during preliminary research, you can still start doing substantive writing towards the finished piece. For example, a lot of character arcs rely on moments that would be independent of the science of your piece. Touching scene between a father and son is going to be the same outside Saturn as it is, in a park on Earth. Telling the scene of a first kiss over dinner is going to be fundamentally the same, no matter if it's on a spaceship or if it's in a fancy restaurant. Yeah, I mean, the bells and whistles around it, the setting and descriptive details will be different, but ultimately, those elements of dialogue you're going for, things like showing chemistry through the back and forth, creating some witty banter to show flirtation, including things like little hand gestures where somebody might brush their fingertips on somebody's arm, the way of flirting, testing the waters, that kind of thing. That's all going to be the same, and it's all stuff you can begin composing early on, and then you can go back through once you have a better understanding of your research to be able to polish those other details, the science of it. That being said, you also don't have to complete all of your research before you begin writing about the science. Instead, one thing we realize is if you have your premise straight, you can continue to read and fine-tune details, especially the more specific science of a piece. So just as an example, when I was working on a novel set in space, one of my big concerns was creating a reasonably realistic space station. And as part of that, I wanted to create a sort of alternate or a false gravity. But I don't believe in anti-gravity because I think it's just kind of science fantasy magic. So, if you're writing a science fantasy book, you have a real simple solution there. Oh, they have anti-gravity. If you're writing a piece of science fiction, you may want to research, what are theoretical models on how this kind of station could use something like the motion of spinning to create a kind of artificial gravity. And so, as I was writing it, I made adjustments to things like the length of the central spoke upon which the station rotated. I looked into the different levels of gravity at different distances from the center. Those elements, I came up with on the fly, through various different speculative discussion forums and things like that. But I didn't need to know that going in. All I needed to know was a premise. My preliminary research told me that a spinning station could create a form of gravity. And then I looked up the details as I got further into the process and when they became specifically necessary in one of the scenes I was composing. Finally, after you've constructed your whole draft, there is a final stage of research where it is not a bad idea to look up a lot of the things you may have invented along the way and see whether or not A, they already exist in writing, B, whether or not there are forums that discuss those kinds of things, or C, whether or not there's any established science that would help either support or refute it. You can always do sort of a proofreading self-check about the accuracy of your science, far into the process after a preliminary draft has been completed. Okay, so one of the hardest parts about working with research, you've built all of this knowledge, you've read all of this cool material, and you've got so many great ideas, and you write it, and you sound a whole lot like you're writing your high school research paper all over again. You find yourself bogged down in exposition and explanation, and I mean, obviously, that's going to be a problem. So, one of the most important elements of writing with research is making sure that the research fits in organically. There's a saying that you don't want your writing to smell of research. And basically, a couple of things to understand for that to help you integrate your research is that the first step to doing it effectively involves having some awareness of point of view and how research works with those point of view. So, for example, if you're writing with a first-person central narrator, so a narrator to whom the bulk of the action is happening, you're writing in the first-person I, you get their fluid thoughts, and you get their actions and observations. First thing to keep in mind is that, honestly, people don't really think detailed explanations. You're probably going to give fragments, snapshots, one or two sentences here and there, maybe even sentences that break off, if you want to create a natural flow of thought. One of the big challenges of creating a science fiction piece in first person is fluidly incorporating both your world building and your science research. However, there are ways to, of course, both mitigate this and to lean into it. If you want to mitigate it, you can have a character with some level of specialization. Now, you want to be a little bit careful with that because you can be very easily overbearing, but at the same time, if you give the character a scientific background, it does give you some leeway to be able to incorporate more fluid scientific thought. But that being said, remember, scientists are always specialized. There is no such thing as a scientist who just knows science. Instead, you're going to have somebody who's trained in a specialty. Their knowledge may overlap with some other fields. I think The Martian by Andy Weir did a really good job of having Mark Watney have the botany knowledge at the core, but then they justify a lot of other technical knowledge through his astronaut training, through necessary engineering experience that came out of his program. Then they also had specialized mission training as well. So Andy Weir layered in several ways to justify a high level of character knowledge that would allow that knowledge to be delivered fluidly and in a little bit more detail. Also, because the character is very specifically isolated and in a scenario fraught with problems, the problem-solving narration also allowed a greater degree of exposition than would normally be necessary in many narratives. Now, that being said, something we also can keep in mind is that we can also selectively choose what our audience is allowed to see. We can have a character who doesn't know all the science. Now, we want to make sure that our premise is sound. So that is an important part of research. But remember, just because you researched it doesn't mean it needs to end up directly represented in the final draft. Instead, it could be something that's kind of just out of sight behind the curtain, where it helped you build the core of your narrative, but you don't necessarily have to show it directly to your readers. So that's a major strategy, is to frame a character who's justifiably present in your scenario, but also has a limited amount of knowledge, and you can actually use that to excuse blurred lines in other places. You can even have characters question things like, is this physically possible? Now, that only goes so far. If you do just utterly disregard physical principles, research principles, you can overextend where you end up with something that feels a little more absurd, potentially a little more silly, and certainly doesn't have that compelling realism. One of the things we want to think about as we do this is one of the reasons we want to incorporate research in all of these points of view is we do tend to anchor our emotions to things we feel like are real and consequential. Now, similarly, though, if we don't want to work in first person, we want to remember there's third person limited, third person omniscient, and third person objective. Each one is going to give us different levels of access to information. The third person omniscient having a strong expectation that all the necessary information is going to be delivered through the narration, and your biggest goal is probably going to be to stay succinct without overwhelming your reader. In third person limited, again, you will be working partially with perspective. So you can also use some of those controls that I talked about for first person. But at the same time, we probably also want to create a little bit more fluid exposition in our third person limited to take advantage of the fact that we are using an external narrator to the action. Finally, third person objective can actually explain some of the concrete scientific principles that our world operates on. So you can incorporate some of that more premise-driven research, but you don't get the thoughts of the characters, and so you don't have to worry about whether the characters are getting it right. As long as you're getting it right, you do simplify your process of incorporation. But at the end of the day, making sure you're not overwhelming your reader with research, making sure that it feels natural when it intrudes on the scene, and you keep it limited when it does, that's going to be the key to an effective research integration. Okay, so now you may be thinking, based on everything I've said, that I really have a focus on sort of gritty science realism. And I do want to stress something really important about that. On the one hand, I do think the universe is truly amazing, and I think science fiction has the opportunity to take advantage of that to build some truly astonishing, compelling content that also sort of informs us about how incredible the universe really is in a form of excellent storytelling. But at the same time, I also got to say, when it comes to thinking about how we work with our research, the rule of cool is also very real. Sometimes you can get away with bending the rules, incorporating something simply because it's kind of awesome. So, just for example, there's an entire planet out there that is made of diamond. So, it's just one of those things that to think about. I mean, realistically speaking, what can you really do with that? It's kind of a plot element that, yeah, you can have people touch down on it, but, what do you do on a planet made of diamond? But at the same time, that's the kind of thing you come across in your research, and you're like, oh, I'm going to find a way to work that in. Maybe it's an offhand comment from a character. Maybe it's just an observation of something somebody scrolls by in a database. But it does stand out because it's cool. If you have, an opportunity to come across an article on, something like black holes colliding and one of them consuming the other. Again, you may not have a strong justification for building that into your story, but it's going to look really cool if you can pull it off. And I mean, really, that's part of what gets us into some of these elements of sci-fi. They are fascinating, they are amazing and cool, and so we can let that dictate or at least steer us to some of the elements we choose to incorporate. If it's cool enough, if it ends up creating an interesting enough sequence, ultimately let the engagement of the reader, let the storytelling itself take precedence, take control of the situation. But yeah, so that is one little addendum as we think about reading academic papers, scouring the internet for some of the cool tidbits about space, about the human body, about particle physics, whatever it is we want to explore. Also, remember, part of what makes science fiction work is that we deal with ideas that are also just kind of cool.